For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. This is the show that examines policies and developments through the intersection of politics and economics to share a fresh perspective with you every week, especially in trying to unpack the underlying strategic imperatives. I am your host, Anil Padmanabhan. Little over a fortnight ago, ISRO's commercial arm successfully placed in space a clutch of satellites owned by London-based OneWeb. This was not a regular satellite launch, the kind that ISRO has perfected to a fine art over the last few decades. Not only was the maneuver complex, 36 satellites had to be placed in what we call the low Earth orbit, or LEO. It's the new holy grail of the business of space. Let us take a look at the launch.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Plus 5 seconds.
P3 tracking.
P1 tracking. Off normal.
भव्य उत्थापन LVM-3 OneWeb India 1 मिशन का
Normal liftoff and an enchantingly beautiful sight of the twin S200 boosters burning.
The launch you just saw was carried out by New Space India Limited, the commercial arm of ISRO. It actually holds a window to the new playbook that has been adopted by India and ISRO to break into the lucrative space economy. To walk us through this and more, we have with us Narayan Prasad. He is the Chief Operating Officer of Satsearch. This is a Netherlands-based firm which is trying to create a marketplace for the global space economy. Most importantly, Narayan is also a chronicler of India's space history, not just past, present, but also the future. His podcast is unmissable. Welcome, Narayan.
Thank you very much, Anil, for having me here. I'm excited to have this discussion with you.
Thank you. As I said in the intro, Narayan, you're one of the best chroniclers of India's space story, both the past, present, and future. Now, so your first thoughts on this big launch that happened a little over a fortnight ago?
Yeah, I think it's a very significant moment for the Indian space program, given the history that we have for 50 plus years. It's not an easy task to put the size of those satellites, 36 of those satellites up into orbit and, do it very precisely. And that's not a task that, many people can do at the end of the day, right? So there's only a very select few countries that can actually perform this in a very successful manner. And, India having demonstrated that is a very, very big milestone. Moreover, I think it signals the fact that given the political and the economic situation today, there could be a lot of gains for India in space commercially, given the fact that, with the war in Ukraine and a lot of the market changes that are happening within China and Russia, then one of the places for low cost manufacturing, low cost launches and things like that will be obviously India then for the rest of the world. So that is something that we can then look at as something that we can take advantage of, as in time and space, and look at what can we do as a part of capturing the global space market. And this is just the first sign of that happening and that phenomena that can occur. So it's from now on, it's only going to be what else can we do and how much can we do are the key questions.
Picking up from where you left off, Narayan, the one interesting feature of this launch was these 36 satellites were all placed in this low Earth orbit. Just first, your thoughts on this achievement and what exactly is low Earth orbit, if you can explain to our viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things about constellations is that satellites need to be placed in different spaces in time. So, for example, when you look at a constellation, it literally means that there are satellites that are in different orbits or in different points within the orbit, so that as one passes over, the other takes over its links. And for this particular OneWeb constellation, for example, traditionally the challenge for a lot of the internet-based applications from space has been that satellites have been in the geostationary orbit, which is typically the 36,000 kilometer orbit, which means that the satellite is always looking at the point wherever you are, so that because the rotation of the satellite matches the rotation speed of the Earth. So, which means that the satellite is constantly above the point of the Earth that you are in, right? But the challenge in that is that although you can cover a large area because you are 36,000 kilometers away, there is always this problem of latency, which means that for the signals to go from the Earth to the satellite and back, there is a latency. It's like having a phone call from the 90s where you say something and you wait for a couple of seconds before you can talk again, right? That's the easiest analogy, right? So that is one of the key challenges that this kind of LEO constellations really address, because suddenly you bring back the whole technology from that kind of 90s experience of phone calls, trunk phone calls, and so on, to the more modern experience of using smartphones and mobile phones, where you instantly talk and the other person instantly responds to you, and the latency periods are extremely small, right? So that is the advantage that you get of being closer to the Earth. So, in that contrast, this is the change that you then need to do is that you only need 3 satellites in the geostationary orbit to be able to cover the entire Earth, because that's the footprint that you get sitting out of 36,000 kilometers. But then, if you do something in the lower Earth orbit, which is in the more of 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 kilometer kind of orbit, then you need a multiple number of them because they pass over and they don't have the same amount of footprint on the Earth than these other satellites do, right? So, which means that you would need a number of these things flying around, so that as they pass around, then the new ones take over and so on. So that's why, for example, OneWeb is, I think, establishing a constellation. I think for their latest numbers shows that there are about 900 satellites that they have, and Starlink is several thousand as well. So these are the mechanics behind why you need only 3 in a geo belt versus several hundred of them in the LEO belt.
So it's like creating a cellular network in space with these satellites, right?
Absolutely. It's putting cell towers in space. That's the closest analogy as well, where essentially, you have the possibility of the architectures that you change is that you may have antennas on the ground that then connect to your home equipment in one form or the other that you purchase as a consumer. Or, people are also now architecting solutions where there could be direct to end user devices. For example, Apple has this new phone where for emergency services, you can have a direct satellite link to the phone, right? So the future is, really about direct end user or consumer electronics to space, for example, for certain applications, or for certain business applications, it could be, having these kinds of high speed links. So, for example, imagine flying around in a Vistara flight or an Indigo flight and having to have 500 Mbps connections where you can simply do all your work while you're going from Trivandrum to Delhi, which is like 3 hours. So you would then use that time to answer all your emails in the silence of the airplane.
Narayan, if you can just take a minute to explain these use cases for LEO for all of us.
Absolutely. There are 2 main branches I would consider for the use cases. Satellites can generally do 2 things from a low Earth orbit, typically, right? One is you would actually use it to image the Earth in many forms. So it could be simply putting a camera up in space, a camera like your cell phone camera, but a bigger one, to take pictures of the Earth and do interesting things from that. Or it could be imaging in other things and other electromagnetic bands. It could be in the infrared band, it could be in other bands, so that you see other interesting information. Every band gives you a certain type of information that is useful. For example, if you image in the RGB band, which is the red, green, and blue bands, you could look at, for example, what is the phytoplankton or the chlorophyll content, and look at the quality of the crops and yield and things like that. Or if you look at something like synthetic aperture radar, which is more of microwaves and using active microwave, then you can image through clouds. For example, look at what is the impact that a flood, for example, is having, or other such disasters are having, where typically you have a lot of cloud cover when there are floods, for example, and it's raining. And then that's when optical cameras may not be that useful to see what is happening under the clouds, right? So that is one family of imaging and imaging based applications that are useful to the society. The other one is obviously communication, and typically broadband is one use case, obviously. But then you could also look at communications. For example, if you are hiking in the Himalayas and there is no cell towers to support any kind of communications that you have, you need sometimes search and rescue operations for anywhere that a group is stuck or so on. So at that point of time, you need to have some sort of communication going to you, and satellites are the only means at that point of time, where you will connect to a particular satellite and send a SOS message that you are stuck somewhere, or you are able to make a brief call that you are stuck somewhere, and people are then going to come get you, hopefully, based on wherever you are. There's also other things, like, for example, if you're on a cruise ship and you're going from I don't know, Goa to somewhere in South Africa. It's a long ride, and obviously there are no cell towers on the ocean, and hopefully you would want to be connected through that journey.
That is fantastic. So, the use case opportunity is obviously very huge, as you just spelled out. And going back to the ISRO launch, the fact that it was LEOs, I believe the size of this low Earth orbit satellites is huge, because what you explained earlier, given the footprint, you need multiple satellites, and they also have a shorter lifespan than the geo satellites. So, in other words, if you connect all these dots, ISRO, or rather its commercial arm, NSIL, is in a position to take a good crack at this opportunity, right? Emerging opportunity. What is your thought?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, there are two functions that you want to look at, right? So one is obviously price to orbit. And the price to orbit comes into the question when you look at what type of rocket do you have. So today, the most cost-effective rocket that is out there is the one from SpaceX, where the cost effectiveness comes from the aspect of reusability of the rocket in itself, right? So nobody else around the world have been able to demonstrate reusability like they have. And that's the key part of reducing the prices when it comes to launch. But even other than that, the other part of all of this is really just the ability to build these rockets in volume, so that they are available on demand for people to then launch. So this has been a very big bottleneck across the world to a large extent, because it's not easy to produce rockets in volume that can also be reliable at the same time, right? So you look at new operators like Rocket Lab, for example. Although they had the first set of failures initially, then they had a range of successful launches, and then the 13th launch or something was a failure for them again. So it sets you back immediately, even if you have one of these failures, because it's expensive for everyone at the same time. So that is something that is a very big challenge that we have in front of us, beyond just optimizing for the cost. The ability for ISRO and NSIL and the industry in general to be able to produce multiple of these rockets every year, to be able to then support any kind of commercial demand, is the core challenge that there is. And then, you could look at other things, because at the end, prices are only an issue once you have availability, and the industry is not in a position where availability is present. So people are willing to compromise on the price for now, because there's a shortage in supply, reliable supply more than anything else. There's about 200 different private companies around the world that intend to build launch vehicles. And at the moment, I think only about 4 of them have demonstrated any kind of capability to get into orbit. And only one with SpaceX was demonstrated with more than enough flights to share that they are able to then do this profit, may not be profitably, but at least reliably at the same time, right? So this is the core part of the challenge.
So, Narayan, implicit in what was also we witnessed a little over a fortnight ago, this fact that this commercial arm of ISRO carried this operation out, the government has clearly separated the commercial part of it to obviously amplify and galvanize the commercial part of the operation. At the same time, you also are seeing a trend where the private sector is graduating from being just vendors, and there are tons of vendors to ISRO, to becoming a partner. So are we also seeing a very big pivot from towards privately funded and privately conducted space operations in India as part of the new playbook?
Yeah, I mean, the dynamic is slightly changing for sure, but it's a question of where. So recently, for example, the government of India, through the New Space India Limited, was able to offload the production of the smaller polar satellite launch vehicle, the PSLV. I think 5 of them at a cost of about 900 crores to the industry, led by a consortium by HAL and L&T, for example. Obviously, this is a much smaller rocket than the GSLV Mark III that went up. And there is a process that needs to then be followed also for the GSLV Mark III and the other new launch vehicles, for example, the small satellite launch vehicle, SSLV, that ISRO is planning to do, to be then handed over to the industry to a large extent. Now, the thing is that these vehicles have been controlled and been built, and also having done quality controls and things like that for launch for the last 50 years from ISRO, and transferring that knowledge to the industry. There is no one single player in this country who will be able to absorb everything in the timelines that there is to be able to be effective, right? So there should be a kind of a consortium approach, because people have been contributing here and there. Like Godrej has been building engines, somebody else has been building something else. So there is always this consortium or the supply chain that is then built up. I think the challenge is really about transferring knowledge, so that processes and especially things around quality control and things like that would be handed over to the relevant industry people, so that the reliability is maintained of the vehicle more than anything else, right? So at the end, you would want to have this reliability aspect to be the core part of this kind of technology transfer. So at the moment, it's starting from the smaller PSLV. We can only hope that this moves into the bigger launch vehicles. Obviously, bigger launch vehicles also make it more complicated to establish a lot of these kinds of things. And also, so there is a learning curve that is involved from going from doing something at the PSLV level to then going into the GSLV levels, right? So I think it's a good start to do this with the PSLV. It also gives the government a sense of how efficiently the private sector can operate by doing these 5 launches. And I think, if hopefully everything goes well, I'm pretty sure that in some years there will be a transfer of technology. So, but I wouldn't expect that to happen anywhere in the next, 1 or 2 years or so on. So I would say the bigger vehicles, the time frame would be more of 4 to 5 years, or even more to a large extent, is more realistic at this point of time. And depends on how things evolve within the local economy and so on.
See, Narayan, earlier you mentioned about SpaceX and how it has cracked this whole satellite launching business by the ability to create reusable rockets. The other side of this is that the margins in obviously in satellite business will get squeezed with such a innovation. Yes, demand may push up prices, but eventually there will be a squeeze. So then, and given all that you told us about LEOs and the potential, underlying potential there, where is the business opportunity then? If it is not going to be satellite launches, where can we expect the business opportunity in space?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, space, like any other value chain, has an upstream to it, a midstream to it, a downstream to it, right? So, if you take the simplest example of internet as an economy, obviously the people who make the most amount of money are the operators who are on the downstream. It's the geos of the world, the airtels of the world, or all of these people who are actually directly talking to the consumer and providing equipment and a service to the consumer and have using the equipment. If you go upstream from them, then you have people who are manufacturing modems and all of these other equipment that support fiber optic cables on the ground and all of them. And so obviously then there is the hub and the gateway and so many other. So there is always going to be industry that is staggered depending on where the end consumer sits. And always in any industry around the world, at the end, whoever sits closer to the end consumer gets the volume, because there's obviously more people on the ground that they can then service right at the end. So there's always going to be a limit on how much of the market that you can address sitting in the upstream, where you're building an X number of satellites or X number of rockets at the end. Whatever you do, apart from doing science and any kind of research and development, there's always going to be a cap on the total addressable market, because out of the 7-8 billion people that the earth has, then the serviceable market for any kind of service that you are creating or is going to be a fraction, and any numbers that you arrive at on the number of launches and the number of satellites is then a portion of that. But then nobody is paying you directly to access your satellite. I mean, that service it may exist in some cases for emergency services so on, but not every consumer on the earth will be able to subscribe to that or will need that subscription at the end, right? So if you are looking at that purely from an economic standpoint, you would want to have more of the geos and the airtels kind of the world be coming out of a country like India, because you would then have large businesses that have a large addressable market that are there. So it could be people who are using, for example, satellite Earth observation imagery, where they're using imagery from space and they're using it to advise farmers, they're using it to advise infrastructure projects or defense or other use cases. Then you have a very sizable market. So if you look at just the agriculture market, it's like 125 farm families that are out there. So obviously the market there, even if you squeeze in 100 rupees per month, still a sizable market, and it'll be a bigger market than the entire launch vehicle industry put together, right? So if you put the entire launch vehicle industry across the world all put together, it'll not even exceed $5 billion a year.
So Narayan, from what you said, there's obviously a big commercial opportunity out there in, say, processing the data that is going to be streamed down by the satellite. So are Indian firms equipped to exploit this opportunity, especially given the fact that this opening up to private sector is pretty nascent, it's just about a few years old. So is India ready to kind of dive into the deep end?
Yeah, I mean, the opening up of the Indian space sector, whatever government is really saying is opening up of the upstream sector, or as in, opening up of the ability to build rockets and satellites by the private sector. That's just a small portion of what can be done at the end of the day. The markets are quite open if you want to do any kind of applications at the end, right? So for example, you could build a multi-billion-dollar business that uses some sort of space technology and applies it to certain industries, and then you're able to provide services not just for the local market in India, but use the advantage of building a product in India to then service other markets in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East and Southeast Asia and other places, right? So India sits at this crossroads where the talent pool that is available in software, in geographical information systems knowledge, information, the ability to work with cloud-related applications and the cloud itself, and then the software talent in front end, back end, all of them being present in the country. And it's just the ability to intelligently organize these things to solve certain problems in the society, to be able to then capture value at the end. So for example, I met a bunch of young guys in Mumbai some time ago, and they don't come from the typical satellite industry. They come from more of the software industry, and they were able to use their knowledge and use satellite data, for example, to build an application that tracks all of the metals and minerals exploitation that is happening around the world.
Narayan, based on what you said, I believe there are about 40 startups in space which have got funding. I suspect the universe will be bigger if you add companies like Zoho, which is bootstrapped and not funded. So, what is the kind of universe we are talking about in the startup space in India who are looking to take a stab at this pie?
The most recent numbers that InSpace and others have quoted, I think, is more of 175 or something like that. They may not all be funded, they may be at various stages. But the problem is that there is no real substantial study that has gone into mapping a lot of these in one form or the other to have all of the knowledge. So the thing is that it's easier to count these startups if they are building rockets or satellites, because it's very obviously space related at this point of time. But it's difficult to map them and know them if they are using satellite imagery, or they are using Navic or GPS to build an application for drones or some other kind of equipment that are out there. That is a little bit more challenging, because you will not have a direct interaction with people at ISRO, or people who are from the actual satellite industry of building equipment, or satellites or rockets. You're simply using some of the tools that have already been existing in one form or the other to just conduct your business, right? So the real challenge is to have a mapping exercise of people who are doing any and all sort of information gathering services, or application services, or end user services.
So, Narayan, my final question to you. Among this, you mentioned about 175, presumably in the range of 200. So, which one of these, or not which one, rather, can any of this lot go on to become a unicorn, or rather India's first unicorn in the business of space?
Absolutely. I think there are some businesses that have really good potential. So, for example, recently a company called Satsearch that is based in Bangalore has scaled very quickly from being a small team of young startup team to becoming already like 130 people within a span of a year, for example. So, and they are able to service especially banks and insurance companies in agriculture by giving intelligence to these banks and insurance companies on the activity that the farmers are doing, either for credit or for insurance purposes, for example, right? So if you look at that market, then there's over 100 million farmers that are present, and then there's farmers that they can address in Africa, in Latin America, and other places. So if they keep growing in that growth trajectory, there's obviously they are going to be a pretty large business that can evolve at the same time, right? So there's other companies, for example, there is a company that is doing water as analytics around water and intelligence around water, called Vasar Labs in Hyderabad. So there are already about 200 people, completely bootstrapped so far. And they are, for example, working with 15 or 20 different governments, both local and international, to be able to provide intelligence around flooding risk, around how do you deal with rivers or even smaller water streams, for example, and for the sustainability of water at the same time, as well as risks of water that are evolving for the governments. So if you look at that as a problem, then you look at every single large city around the world, it's around water. At the end, water is probably the biggest problem that every single large city in the world that has today, right? Look at Mumbai, Chennai, Kolkata, every other city that is big, right? So again, this could be a very large company at the end, because you are looking at risks that you can then offer. So it's not just for the governments, it could also be for private people.
You heard Narayan. The margins are no longer in the satellite launch business. Instead, it is moving downstream to processing the data that is generated by these satellites. The good news is that several Indian startups are already queuing up to take a stab at this business. If all goes to plan, maybe the next unicorn from India will be a space startup. Thank you for watching. Do remember to subscribe to StratNewsGlobal, hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates, and please do share your feedback and insights with us. I am available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.